we're lucky to have the herons that we have in the valley. So it was kind of scary to hear that there's been a real decline in the population, and fortunately, Montana Audubon is doing this research. The people who are chairing all of this is Carmen, I won't say your name right, Borchelt, and she her parents didn't know when they introduced her to Montana that she'd eventually leave home and come to the mountains. And so maybe you can say just a smidge about yourself, Carmen, and your position.
Yeah, so I moved to Montana about 6 years ago. Originally to go to school out here at the University of Montana in Missoula. And I spent summers in Glacier working with the concessionaires. I spent summers working down at Lewis and Clark Caverns near Bozeman area. And eventually it's led me to Montana Audubon, which I'm very excited to be here.
Okay, thank you. And so Bo, boy, I think we could do a whole program on Bo. I mean, you have some incredible life already, and you're still just a kid, I know. Anyway, and you've worked all over Montana and the West in all kinds of agencies and programs. Maybe you could tell us, you know, your favorite place that you've worked other than Montana Audubon, and then about what you're doing for Montana Audubon.
Well, that would be impossible to choose a favorite, because I've been fortunate to work in so many beautiful places. I've been a professional field technician for a long time. And as you all may know, a lot of projects end up taking place in national forests and national parks and our beautiful public lands. So I've worked in every single state in the American West, doing bird research, usually in just gorgeous, stunning areas, and just so many jobs that I am so nostalgic about. But yeah, I went to school at the University of Montana in Missoula, and back in 2005, I started doing field work everywhere. So I don't know, favorite place is maybe I worked for 9 years in all around the Southwest, specifically around Marfa, Texas, in Southwest Texas, where I did 9 years of winter grassland surveys. So I got to see all of our, or many of our our summer grassland birds. I got to see them where they spend their winter and monitor the populations down there. And as opposed to a lot of Texas that I'm not too into, West Texas was just a gorgeous area, and just kind of a desolate grassland wilderness that I really, really cherished. So I may have to go with that. But I started working for I lived in Canada for 2 years and started working for the Montana Natural Heritage Program in 2016. And after about 3 years of doing that, I got a joint position with the Montana Audubon and the Montana Natural Heritage Program. And my title is an avian specialist, and I do everything from field work, working on a bunch of different projects, doing black swift surveys in Glacier, and long-billed curlew trapping and monitoring in south of Malta. Just work all over the state, and also do a lot of data management. So right now, for example, I'm reviewing hundreds of thousands of eBird records, in order to, we have to do this before adding them to the Montana Natural Heritage Program database. So just making sure everything is legit, and no rare birds are reported where they shouldn't be, and that kind of stuff. So a lot of time in the office compared to back in the day when it was all field work, but I love it. It's great work.
Well, that's great. Thank you, guys. Well, okay, Carmen, are you going to start off and begin your program?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, I'm going to get out of here.
All right, so I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Perfect. So thanks everybody for joining today. This Great Blue Heron project is something Bo and I have worked very closely with, and we are very excited about. This project really has taken a team to put together. And of course, we cannot go without mentioning Amy Siemens, who is also joining us as a guest, the Director of Policy and Science, one of the head masterminds of this project. This project was a collaboration effort between Montana Audubon and the Montana Natural Heritage Program. And that's where Bo Crees comes from. It's a shared staff position, and it helped make this project happen, mainly because we share a lot of the same priorities, such as having the most up-to-date bird data and information and making that available to the public. The reason being that the Montana Natural Heritage Program is the state source for biological information on all of Montana's species. This same source has the responsibility of helping all species managers determine the conservation threats and rankings of all the Montana species as well. This ranking system that factors heavily into our program direction by providing us with all of the state species of concern list. And so Bo will go into much more detail about his portion of the survey and the project. And why I didn't really say much of what I did previously is because I have a whole slide on it right here. But what my title is, I'm the Big Sky Watershed Corps member here with Montana Audubon this year. My program ran from January and it just ended on Friday. And so what this Big Sky Watershed Corps program is it's a 3-part-way partnership between the Montana Conservation Corps, the Montana Watershed Coordination Council, and the Soil and Water Conservation District. And my main portion with Montana Audubon has been working with Amy Siemens very closely with these citizen science programs and helping them build capacity, run smoother, volunteer generation, outreach, so on and so forth, as well as a bunch of field work that I got to join that Bo mentioned as well. And so some of you may have worked with Caroline last year, and we'll also have a new member coming on this January. His name will be Peter. And there's actually even some in the Bitterroot area. There's some with the Bitterroot Waterform as well as the Lolo Watershed Group. And the Big Sky program is pretty much there to help build capacity for Montana's watershed nonprofit organizations. And so some of you are probably wondering why Great Blue Herons? And also, when did this project even happening? And I've never heard of this project. And that's because this is actually the first year that Montana Audubon ran the citizen science program. And that's because the Great Blue Heron is actually on the species of concern list in Montana. This project ran from May to June this year, and it was a pilot year and a successful one at that. We had over 50 volunteers serving over 30 locations across 12 watersheds all throughout Montana, all the way up from Libby, all the way down south of Dillon, all the way east of Billings to Forsyth, all the way up to Malta, and even within the Bitterroot Valley. And so a little bit of the natural history of the Great Blue Heron. Now, the Great Blue Heron is actually one of Montana's species of colonial waterbirds, a description that pertains to their habitat of their nesting in colonies or rookeries. These colonies can be found anywhere from a few to over a dozen nests. These colonies are typically found along large waterways in Montana. in either large cottonwood stands, ponderosa pines, or even bulrush. Many of us have seen a heron rookery along one of these major waterways. And herons use our rivers and creekside habitats like sandy banks and sandbars to cottonwood galleries and forest and the streamside vegetation. So we definitely cannot go without mentioning how important these riparian habitats are. Species that are reliant on Montana water-based habitats. There's over 94 million acres in Montana, and about 3 to 4% of those is waterways. This includes sandbars, emerging wetland vegetation, bogs, marsh, wet meadows. As we know, most any area with water is always abundant with life. And there's over 440 species of birds in Montana, and 50% of them rely on waterways for nesting. Not only is this used for breeding birds, but it's also used for migrating birds as well. And so it's also fun to always point out that not only the great blue herons use this, but shorebirds, raptors, songbirds, eagles also use all of these waterways and wetlands. And this just goes again to emphasize how important these areas are, but to birds, but all wildlife. And so now, where do we typically find great blue herons? The image on the left, we can see a map of the whole United States. This is from the website All About Birds. And the image on the right is actually our state database from the Montana Natural Heritage Program. Now we can see if we go back to the left side, the All About Birds map does not really indicate that we have great blue herons in western Montana. And we already know that is untrue, with one of the most well-known rookeries being Lee Metcalf, right in your home territory, as well as the Nine Pipes Rookery or even the Helena Regulating Reservoir, are one of the most popular rookeries in the western portion of the state. And looking at the map on the right, we can see a range that we're a little more familiar with. The purple represents areas where great blue herons are found year-round, and they do winter here in their breeding range. And so we can actually see here, the left is an image taken from eBird, and it's a real-time picture that there are great blue herons in Montana and even over in the western portion of the state. Now, some exciting facts that I actually found in the Birds of Montana book. The first known nesting west of the Continental Divide was along the Clark Fork River near Drummond in 1931. And the first published winter record occurred along the Bitterroot River near Stevensville in 1948. So how interesting is that? And now, we can see here from this map, this little thunderstorm map, is a breeding bird survey trend map from 1966 to 2015. And now the eBird map does indeed indicate and show that herons are all over Montana, but why is the great blue herons a species of concern if they're all over the place? Now, the breeding bird surveys have actually indicated that there has been an annual decline of about 2.2% each year from 1966 through 2015. And a number of factors can come into play with this and what may be affecting the population decline, including things from the decline of riparian cottonwood stands, increased urban sprawl and human disturbance during the nesting season, human disturbance in general, changing conditions of waterways, road construction, logging, so on and so forth. And with these changing conditions, it is not uncommon to see herons abandon nests and relocate, moving to more remote and undisturbed areas, making it harder for us to survey their populations. And looking at this thunderstorm map, we can actually see that there is an increase in the western portion of the state with the blue, the teals, and the yellows. But then we can also look at the eastern portion and see that it's all red and where they are declining. And now here we can see that there's actually around 80 to 100 locations all around Montana. And we can see that there are actually some pretty good rivers that you can see that they like to go along. The Yellowstone River is a pretty good hotspot, as well as the Bitterroot Valley. So let's go ahead and we'll zoom right into the Bitterroot Valley. So here we can see Hamilton on the very bottom of the screen, and then Stevensville at the very top. And all these white and black circles are actually indicators of where heron rookeries are at or used to be. And these dates of observations ranging from 1969 to 99, all the way to 2005, and most recently 2011. And even since 2011, the rookeries have changed. There are about 6 surveys that actually took place within the Bitterroot Valley with the Citizen Science Project that we did. And they unfortunately all came back with no sightings of nests and no sightings of herons at the 6 locations they were surveying. So although that is disheartening to hear that all those rookeries were abandoned, this is actually the up-to-date information that we are looking for when doing this Great Blue Heron survey. And so the last up-to-date information we have is actually from this the breeding colonial waterbird survey. And I know, although we are familiar with many locations across the state where herons nest or are known to travel, the status and trend monitoring standpoint, most of what we know in Montana, and one of the best sources comes from this survey here. And this survey took place from 2009 to 2011, so 3 years. It was published in 2014, so you can note the date down here. But all the data was collected in those 3 years of 2009 through 11. And now, very intensive, this took place all across the western portion of the US. And now at this point, where this data is about a decade old, all of it came from 2011, and we're almost to 2021 right now. And so there was that's where Amy came in with the Montana Natural Heritage Program, and we're asking questions, what can we do about this? And with that, and with the collaboration with the Montana Natural Heritage Program, we were able to launch this project of the Great Blue Heron monitoring. And so the very, very start of the project was with Bo Crees and his aerial mapping to figure out where exactly they are in Montana and if this is even a good process to go about with the aerial mapping that he will talk about. And so within the 2020 survey season that Montana Audubon conducted, there was actually 278 nests that were located, 161 herons. There was over 50 locations across all of Montana. 23 of them, unfortunately, were not occupied, were occupied, and 27 were unfortunately abandoned. And that was with the help of over 30 volunteers. And coming this year, we are definitely looking at new sites and updating the old ones. And so if there are any questions or any interests about potentially of wanting to survey for them, please feel free to contact me. And so with that, Bo Crees will actually go ahead and share his screen on how the project first began and where the brainstorming began.
Okay. Thank you, Carmen. That was awesome. That was a great overview. I'm going to talk, I guess I'll regress a little bit and talk about the first part of this project, which was whether it would even be a good idea or if it's viable to search for heron rookeries using aerial imagery, which is something that seems kind of easy and intuitive, but just hasn't been tried in Montana. And so I think Amy Seaman and Bryce Maxwell and probably some other folks came up with the idea. I know Scott Bloom from the Heritage Program noticed while doing some georeferencing that in certain locations you can actually see heron nests just by scrolling around the screen in Google Earth or using other aerial imagery such as NAPE. So we wanted to know whether this could be potentially a good way to keep track and even maybe long-term monitoring of heron populations. And also maybe it would show us that we can actually find rookeries that have not been previously reported in remote parts of the states where it's hard to send people. And so let me share my screen here. And I'd like to apologize in advance because I haven't done many presentations and not very well versed with PowerPoint or Zoom. So if anything ends up being kind of clunky or something, my bad. Hopefully you'll still get something out of it. Now let me try to share my screen here.
And if there are any questions throughout Bo's portion of the talk, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat box, and we can answer all of them at the very end.
Is it? Okay. Yeah, and please interrupt if all of a sudden you can't hear me or something. Let me know. Okay, and so this was this project started about a year ago, maybe a little longer, and it was a very short project, which can be a good thing in science. It was basically just to test and see whether this even works. So I actually spent, I think, just over 3 days doing this mapping exercise. And I think you'll see that it worked out pretty well. Okay, so for most of the year, great blue herons are solitary. I'm sure a lot of you have seen them in pairs, and sometimes you see even more than two in one location. But generally, you'll see a single heron walking around, foraging along the edge of a pond in a golf course or Lee Metcalf or something. Because herons are so big and charismatic, they're very visible when you're around cities and towns. But throughout rural parts of Montana, they forage and roost in habitats that are not captured and well represented by structured surveys like point counts and lake surveys. Imagine doing a point count. Even if you're close to a creek, there's a good chance that there's going to be vegetation in the way, and you'd have to be just right in the right place in the right time, and herons don't really call. So it can be kind of challenging to get a good idea of their numbers and trends in the state. But herons conveniently are colonial nesters, and they congregate at rookeries during the breeding season. And so it can be very helpful to know where all of these rookeries are in the state, and can really help us get a good grasp of what's going on with populations in Montana. So with this project, we wanted to see how well we can find these rookeries using aerial imagery. So these surveys, when you're not looking at a computer screen in the comfort of your office, these surveys can be pretty challenging. If we're talking about ground surveys, observers on the ground can target specific locations, but cannot survey large continuous areas such as river corridors due to limited road access and land ownership issues. You can walk a few hundred meters along the river and then you probably couldn't do it anymore. So it's a really hard way to systematically survey for colonies. Another potential way to survey for colonies is to float down our major river systems. These float surveys can take a long time, can be challenging, can be even dangerous if water conditions are tricky, too low or too high, excuse me. And obviously when you're in a river and you're along the edge of a very dense cottonwood gallery, it can you can easily overlook a rookery because all you can see is a wall of trees, and the rookery might be 100, 200 meters back. So river floats are not ideal for this. A good way to monitor rookeries and to search for new ones is doing small plane surveys. And we know that this is an effective way of doing it. Back in 2009 through 2011, I believe there was a lot of small plane surveys done along the Yellowstone, Tongue, and some other major rivers, and they yielded a bunch of rookeries. I think the surveys were for bald eagle, not specifically for herons, but when you're up there in a plane, a lot of these nests are way easier to see and find. The issue with small plane surveys, I guess, is logistics can be pretty complicated. They could be costly, not necessarily, but they could be kind of expensive. You're putting people in the air, flying over rivers, so there's always a safety issue, I guess. And it's just unlikely, even if we can monitor the Yellowstone or the Clark Fork, it might be tricky to do the entire state and kind of find any potential cottonwood gallery and survey it with a small plane. It could be very tricky and expensive. So we thought aerial imagery surveys can fill the gap, and we wanted to see how effective these kind of surveys are. So using the aerial imagery surveys, we can actually get to, if you will, by sitting in the office, we can actually get to remote undersurveyed areas that nobody would check otherwise. So to do this, we used mainly Google Earth, which is very easy to navigate. Most of you have probably played around Google Earth. It has quality and fairly up-to-date imagery layers collected throughout multiple years. So sometimes going back to the early 2000s. Most of those are not very good, but most of the newer ones are nice and sharp. Google Earth is free and available to anyone that has internet access. For this small pilot project, we selected 5 IBAs, important bird areas, that have rivers with extensive cottonwood galleries. We surveyed along, it's funny to say we surveyed along because I sat in the office the whole time, but so surveyed along the Yellowstone River upper and lower reach, that's 2 different IBAs, the Tongue River, the Clark Fork Grass Valley, and the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Area. And we kind of chose those sort of at random, but we did know that they have nice cottonwood galleries, as a lot of you may know. So how do we go about systematically surveying these river stretches? And how do we know what exactly to look for? What does a great blue heron rookery even look like from above? And I'll get into some picture and some imagery. This is kind of boring, but so an efficient Great Blue Heron rookery searcher first needs to develop a good search image. You got to know what you're looking for, or else, you know, all these little blobs and things can look like a rookery or not look like a rookery. So in order to first develop a good search image, we zoomed in to known rookery locations, like the one in Lee Metcalf. There's one by White Earth, the Helena Regulating Reservoir. There's a bunch of known ones. And we studied several things. First, we had to know what's the ideal viewing elevation. If you're way too high above the ground level, you're not going to see anything. And if you're too low, where you can see, you know, 3, 4, 5 trees within your field of vision, you may see things very well, but it would take forever to cover literally hundreds of miles of river, you know, slowly shifting the screen from side to side or up and down. It would just take an incredible amount of time. So after a little bit of experimenting, we found out that the sweet spot of eye elevation for both detection, rookery detection and speed is usually about 700 feet to 1,000 feet above ground level. We looked at other things like in the known rookeries, like typical distance between nests, the average nest diameter. This ended up being very helpful and important because a lot of times when, and I'll get to this, but a lot of times when you see a suspect rookery, if you measure the nest, which Google Earth allows you to do, you can tell whether, oh, this is way too small for a heron, or this is actually like 5 yards across. That's definitely not a heron nest. And we looked at other things like nest shape and color. It's usually, nests are usually nice white circles in the middle of the cottonwood canopy. We looked at rookery locations within cottonwood galleries. Are they usually close to the edge or right in the center? And other things like that to help us know exactly what we're looking for once we're searching for unknown rookeries and doing a blind search. Meaning when I did this, I had no idea where rookeries were located. And just wanted to see how easy it is or not easy it is to find them. And so this is basically how I made sure to not overlook anything. As you can imagine, it would be very easy to miss a little stretch of cottonwood gallery by just kind of randomly going up and down. But what's nice is that Google Earth allows you to click on a grid. The grid is 280 meters by 400 meters. I'm not sure what's the significance of this, but that's the only grid size that's available. And once you have a grid, you can follow the grid down and make sure that every grid cell is thoroughly surveyed and nothing is being overlooked. So in areas where the river is generally oriented east to west, the grid cell or the grid survey is best to do north to south. And areas where the river is generally north to south, like the Bitterroot River, it's easiest and best cover is going east to west along the river. And it would probably take about, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 20 seconds to do a grid cell. It depends on how dense the cottonwood gallery is and whether you're finding anything suspicious. And but it's really, really pretty simple. And so, and that's great to be able to say that, because a lot of times you're trying to find all sorts of complicated ways of doing it, and takes a long time. And this is a pilot project that essentially took 3.5 days to get at some results. So that's awesome. So Here's a typical rookery here on the left side. This one, I believe, is on the Tongue River, about 20 miles south of Ashland. And a typical rookery from about 700 to 1,000 feet elevation above ground has however many nests, usually 5 to 20 or so. The nests are a few meters apart. They look like little white circles. And a lot of times when the imagery is sharp enough, you can actually zoom in and see a dark circle in the middle of the nest, which makes it conclusive. You don't have to doubt about it. And then you can easily measure it with a ruler on Google Earth. So when I ran into these kind of rookeries, it's great. I added up the number of nests and marked them, recorded the location and a few other details, distance to water and other things. And easy peasy and moving on to the next one. But what happened a lot is that there were some confusing images and the imagery wasn't very sharp. So for example, here on the right, what is that? Is that a rookery? It seems like there's too many nests, too close together, but it does kind of look like nests and the imagery is not very sharp. So there's a few things that we were able to do to kind of help determine whether it's a rookery or not. So for example, when we encounter a potential rookery, we need to first switch between the available imagery layers and find the sharpest one. It's a little tricky because sometimes as you move along the river and the imagery is really sharp, something happens. Maybe the sun position changed and all of a sudden the layer that you're enjoying and finding a lot of stuff in becomes fuzzy and unclear. The shadows are confusing. So you kind of have to go back and forth between different layers. I'll show you at the end. I'll try to show you on Google Earth how to switch between layers if you haven't done that before. But it's kind of cool, and you can always go very quickly and easily back and forth and find the best one to find rookeries. And so here's a rookery on the CMR on the Missouri River. This is probably 2013, and this is a few years later. You see how much sharper it is. The zoom is not the same for the two of these, but you get the point. Here's another example of differences in imagery quality. This happens to be the most recent one, but a lot of times if you go back a few years, for whatever reason, you get clearer, sharper images. So you have to go back and forth all the time to be able to make sure that you're not missing anything just because it's fuzzy or something. So that's one way of confirming whether a rookery is, oh, here's another example. This is the one we were just looking at, that weird one with a lot of little white blobs. If I look at this date, which is earlier than this one, you can see it looks even less like a rookery. And at some point you can just kind of, especially with a little bit of experience, say, well, this is definitely not a rookery. But there is another tool that I mentioned before, and that's the ruler. We found that very consistently, sorry about the fuzziness, but that's how it is when you're looking for rookeries. So it's not that there's any problem with your screen, it's just you have to deal with a lot of fuzzy imagery. But here's one that's fuzzy because it's zoomed in a lot. And you can see that this is using the Google Earth ruler, and pretty much every nest is about 1 meter across. I think the biggest one I found was maybe 1.5 meters, so 4.5 feet across. But it's a pretty reliable thing. And a lot of times you can see a dark spot in the middle, which also indicates it's a nest. Now, when we use the ruler on the mystery spot here, we can see that these blobs are way too small to be heron nests. I mean, 3 of them can, or 4 of them might be able to fit in a single meter. So I'm not sure exactly what these are. It could be some parasitic plant like mistletoe, or in some locations you can suspect they might be cormorants or some other birds. But I think usually it's just some sort of a die-off or a parasite or something. But you do have to be careful about these. Now, one thing we found when we switched between imagery layers is that you can actually learn a lot about what happened to a given colony. And you can see by switching between years, a lot of times whether the colony is growing, it's shrinking, it just disappears. So it actually can give us some interesting information that can be useful for all sorts of management things. So here you can see one that on the right, you see images that were taken in, what was it, June 16, 2013. It's a nice tree right here with about 7 nests, maybe more. And then only less than a month later, looking at the same location, the tree is down, the nests are gone. And so we can know that rookery no longer exists just by sitting in the office and looking at the computer screen at satellite and other aerial imagery, which I think is really cool and could potentially be useful for other things. This was just a pilot project, but it's just nice to know that we can see such specific events and keep track of them. And so, unfortunately, if this happened, if this rookery was occupied, there's a good chance that we lost some individuals too. But that's important to know. But yeah, so, oh, and another thing is, imagine trying to gain this kind of information from doing ground surveys or being in a boat or on a plane. It doesn't really tell a story because we don't have a time series that we have when we do aerial imagery surveys. So here are some of the results of these surveys. Like I said before, the surveys were blind. I did not know where any of the previously reported rookeries were located. And this is in order for us to know whether it's a viable way of detecting rookeries, known or unknown. So after carefully mapping and recording, we compared all of the newly found rookeries, which are in this image, the yellow triangles. This is just a little tiny screenshot, but this is a part of the Yellowstone River, and we did almost the entire stretch. But so the yellow triangles are where I detected rookeries. The green squares are where there are historical or known rookeries. And what's really neat is that when you use GIS, you can can turn these layers on and off and really see where there's overlap. And so, for example, here on the left, we can see, I hope all of you can see this, but we can see that there's a green square right on top of a yellow triangle, which means I found a known existing rookery. There's other locations that have green squares but no yellow triangles, meaning, especially when I first turned this layer on to show me where are all the historical rookeries, I was like, oh shoot, I missed this one. And so what I had to do at this point is to go back to all of these green triangles that were not next to yellow triangles and see whether I couldn't find the rookery because maybe I overlooked it. Maybe it was a little blurry. I just maybe didn't do a good job. Or potentially it just wasn't detectable, meaning maybe this is a rookery from 1970, and in 1972 it no longer existed and there's no sign of it now. Maybe it could even be that certain locations, historical rookeries especially, just weren't mapped correctly back in the day. Maybe they put it on the wrong island or something. So I had to go back and make sure that rookeries that were detectable were in fact detected. Because if too many of these were not detected, then we would know that this is not a very good way of surveying for rookeries. And so that was a big part of the project. So I re-examined all previously known rookeries, and out of those, so only a single rookery out of 17 previously known rookeries that were detectable, meaning there was some sign of them that I or an observer could possibly find. Only one of those was overlooked by me. Other people probably could very well have seen it. So this means that 94% of all rookeries that were detectable were actually detected, which is great, in my opinion at least. We know that a trained observer can find rookeries if in fact they are visible. The great thing was also that we found 8 rookeries that were not previously reported to the Heritage Program or to eBird. So just ones that, most of those were in remote locations where we know that nobody carried any structured surveys and they didn't have any, actually some of them were along survey flight routes, but for whatever reason, they were overlooked. Some of these cottonwood galleries are really extensive. So if you're flying over the south end of the gallery, there's a chance you wouldn't even see what's going on the north end. They could be more than a mile wide in some locations, usually not that wide. But so it's great to know that by sitting in the office, nice, warm and cozy, we can actually find active rookeries around the state. I think that's fantastic. Here's this little table shows the different IBAs and how many historical rookeries are there, how many were not found. Again, most of them, the vast majority of them were not found, not because I moved through too fast through the screens, but just because they were not findable. They're not detectable. They just weren't there. And one of the reasons we want to send people out there and do some ground truthing and ground surveys, which is great that we have the Audubon effort to send volunteers out there, is to confirm that in fact these rookeries are not being overlooked. They're really not there. So that's why that component of the project is so important, to do some get some confirmation. So during the blind mapping, these are the ones that I actually found, and only a single one along the Yellowstone River was actually there when I went back to it to search at the green square, and I just happened to overlook it. And as you can see here, we got some promising numbers of rookeries that nobody has reported previously, found in each one of the IBAs. So there's a long but I think pretty interesting discussion about some of our results. So nearly all of the rookeries we found had a distinctive appearance that made them easily discernible from the background. This is great to know. Mapping rookeries using aerial imagery appears to be very effective, but ground truthing is necessary. Oops, I didn't want to do that. Ground truthing is necessary to verify rookeries are not being missed or misidentified. To be most useful, rookery mapping efforts rely on up-to-date, high-resolution aerial imagery. Currently, the best imagery layers are not necessarily the most recent ones. As imagery quality and recency improves, so will our ability to assess rookery and population trends for this vulnerable species in Montana. Based on the amount of time needed to survey the selected IBAs, which was about 3.5 work days, we estimate it would take about 20 to 30 days to survey the entire state using aerial imagery. I would kind of lean towards the low end of that estimate. Plus, the more you do it, the better you get at it, the quicker you are. So I would think 20 days might be sufficient to map the entire state for rookeries. Depending on our findings during the upcoming volunteer surveys, some of them took place already this year, and there's going to be upcoming ones in 2021. It may be worthwhile to continue mapping rookeries on all major waterways in Montana in order to establish a rookery location baseline. Comparing this baseline to future aerial imagery will allow us to see individual rookery growth, decline, and movement, and may help us determine the cause of such changes. Comparison of the number of rookeries and nests within rookeries will allow better assessment of population trends and conservation status for this species in Montana. Aerial imagery surveys offer a simple, cost-effective way of finding unreported rookeries in remote areas or areas lacking other types of structured surveys. And it appears we can get reasonably accurate nest counts in most rookeries using this survey method, especially when linked to actual ground surveys for confirmation. While these nest counts offer little direct information about the actual nesting outcome, because you're seeing an image from months or years ago, they can actually point to breeding population size and trends when assessed over time and on a watershed scale. So we'll be able to, hopefully with better imagery, see how a given colony grows or shrinks over time, or even hopefully not, but just disappears. So that said, in my opinion, considering this is such a quick little pilot project, I would say it's definitely a success. And I'm excited to continue with this and see how well we do with new imagery layers, like newer imagery, sharper imagery, and also in other parts of the state that we haven't monitored before. So now I'll give you a quick demonstration on Google Earth, very quick and easy, to show you how to do a basic aerial imagery survey. So some of you will recognize this area. This is a basic Google Earth interface. Here we have Lee Metcalf National Wildlife Refuge. And so when you go to view in the upper left, you can switch the grid on and off. So first thing is make sure you have a grid, 280 meters by 400, if you may remember. Then you want to zoom in to a location, and this is just a demonstration starting here kind of arbitrarily. Obviously, you want to be very systematic about it. But we see here on the bottom right that the ground elevation is about 3,200 feet and the eye altitude is 4,900 feet. So I want to get within, in order to see nests better, I want to get within about 1,000 feet elevation. So you want to be around 4,200 feet right here, because it's 3,200 feet ground level. And now we have our grid lines, so we can stay within the grid lines and make sure we don't overlook anything. And you slowly scroll along and look for that signature of a rookery, which are little white dots or circles. on top of the canopy. And some areas, obviously, you can move through much faster. And I think something's coming up here. I have a feeling. And all of a sudden, we see a few little white dots here. I hope you all can see them. What's nice about Google Earth and doing this kind of work is you can always zoom in and get as close as you need to. I wouldn't want to scan being this close, because imagine how long it would take just going like this if you're really, really zoomed in. But once you do see something suspicious, you can get nice and close. And then if for whatever reason you weren't sure this is a rookery, you can go and, let's see, right on the bottom left, you see it says 1995 here. If you click on that, it gives you on the top left a list, if you will, of all of the different imagery layers that are available. And you can see some of the older ones are just completely worthless. But once you get into newer imagery, 2006, 2009, you can see the image quality tends to get better. And but look at this, for example. This is 2013. This rookery actually existed in 2013, as most of you may know, but you barely see anything here. And that's why it's important to, especially in areas where you suspect there might be rookeries or you see any sort of a sign, to go back and forth and look at, so now we're 2014 and there's very visible nests here. And let's keep moving here. Here's August 2019. Look at how this rookery is actually growing. This is August 2019. We have nests right down here. If you go to 2014, there's nothing here. And that's normal and natural. The rookeries grow and shrink. It's not necessarily a big deal, but it does have the potential of showing us trends, which is really interesting. And so 2019, we have probably the best layer right here. And if I still am not sure that this is in fact a Great Blue Heron rookery, I can always zoom in even more. It gets a little blurry, but so here's a white circle with a black dot in the middle. That's always a good sign. And right on top here, we have the ruler, which allows us we can choose whatever units we want to measure the diameter of the nest. So we know most of them are about 1 meter across. And what do we, oops, why is it not showing anything? And this is about 1.2 meters or so. That's pretty spot on, 1.1 meters. And so that's how you do it. It's really simple and easy, and a great way to be able to do some scientific research and surveys in the middle of the winter when you can't really do anything else in the field. You can give us a lot of information about the status of this species of concern in Montana, and also gives us plenty of information to then follow up on once we do citizen science surveys come spring and summer. So I thought it was really good results for such a quick little pilot project, and it's very promising for the future. So now let me go back to my thank you slide. And I'd like to thank Bitterroot Audubon for the invitation and for your interest in the project. I hope the presentation was interesting. I'd also like to thank Dan Backen, Bryce Maxwell, and Scott Bloom from the Montana Natural Heritage Program for all of their help with the office portion of this project. And Carmen and Amy Seaman, of course, from Montana Audubon, for the many hours they spent organizing, planning, recruiting, and helping citizen scientists such as as yourselves to get out and help us with ground truthing and rookery monitoring. And I hope that this upcoming summer, many of you will volunteer for this, because it's really fun to go out there and hopefully see herons, or we can get some really good information about places where rookeries no longer exist. That's also important. So thanks again. And Carmen and I will be happy to take any questions and talk about the project. So thanks a bunch, everyone.
Thank you, Bo. There actually is a question from Sarah. Has there been any consideration of using drones to confirm or count nests in addition to the Google Earth?
So I don't know the answer to that. Well, drones are getting better and better. I was going to say one problem with that could be that if you to do large scale surveys, obviously it's not really a viable option. Although some drones nowadays can cover really large distances, and it seems to me that at this point it would still be kind of challenging to do, you know, the Yellowstone River from Billings to North Dakota, or to to North Dakota. With a drone, that would be challenging. I think drones could be very useful and helpful if we're targeting a specific area. But in order to know that we need to target that area, we would have to either look at historical rookery records, or do this kind of work to kind of set the stage for the drone. And then we can send an experienced drone person, flyer, to a specific location and help us confirm whether the rookery is still active, or if it's actually there. And I think for that, drones could be extremely useful, though I'm not sure how a drone would affect the herons, you know, within the colony, within the rookery. That could have an adverse effect if it gets too close. As Carmen mentioned earlier, herons can be very sensitive to any sort of disturbance during the incubation and brooding period. And a lot of rookeries have been known to be abandoned when any sort of disturbance, like people walking underneath, or you know, too much boat traffic sometimes. There's been all sorts of weird incidents where people did stuff that they didn't think would really affect a rookery, and end up getting abandoned. So it's very interesting, but I'm not sure how viable it is with a drone.
Yeah, I agree with the human disturbance. It would have to depend on the time of year if it were to be done. But that would be definitely a high consideration, is not wanting to disturb them. But are there any more questions?
I have a comment, actually, if that's okay, or you know,
Hopefully.
to add. I flew a lot of heron rookeries around here in FWP Region 2 when I was working, and including the Bitterroot. I did a few flights on the Bitterroot, and I want to back up what Bo said. With wide river bottoms, it's hard to fly them with a Super Cub, and you can miss rookeries. But I did notice that some rookeries would be active one year, and then, you know, a couple of years later, when I'd get to fly again, they weren't active, and then a couple of years later, they'd be active again. And on the Clark Fork River, I had funding from the Natural Resource Damage Program to do aerial surveys of the colonial waterbirds up around Warm Springs Wildlife Management Area. Well, to get there, I had to fly the whole river from Missoula to Warm Springs. And so I flew the Clark Fork almost every year from 2009 to 2014. I might have missed I think I missed 2013. And one of the things that I observed in there was that the rookeries did move around, and so there were rookeries that you'd think, well, they're abandoned because the herons used them before and they don't use them anymore. But I added up the number of heron nests that I saw, estimated that were active every year, and the number was about the same. But some years they'd be nesting here, and in other years they'd be nesting there, and it seemed as though the smaller the rookery, the more likely they were to be moving around and not be in the same place year after year after year. But on the other hand, the exception to that was there used to be a lot of there was a big rookery up at Warm Springs Ponds, and they were nesting in these shrubs at the upper end of one of the big ponds, and all the shrubs had been flooded from when they made the ponds, and they were all tipped over and dying, and the herons would nest in those shrubs over the water. And over the years, those shrubs just rotted and fell in the water and were no longer available. And the herons sort of trickled out of there and started forming new colonies up some of the adjacent creek bottoms, and not always even on the main stem of the river, but up the tributaries. And then there another one showed up, and literally in this people's front yard, you could see it from the interstate. So again, focusing on the river alone, sometimes they'll be nesting off the river. And so I guess the point that I figured out is you have to be cautious in concluding that the population is decreased just because you see abandoned rookeries. There's more monitoring that needs to be taken place to determine what the population's actually doing, and probably doing a full, like a big section of a river year after year or every other year or whatever would be a better indication of what's going on. And again, some of the nests persist for a number of years if the rookery's been abandoned, but eventually they blow out and so forth. So it's a pretty dynamic system out there. But I think this is a great project, and when I started working on this, the aerial photos weren't very good. They're getting better and better. And so that's totally awesome.
Mhm. Thanks, Christy. That's a great point. And I've seen basically exactly what you just described from firsthand experience. I've seen that a lot in the literature too. And I suspect when I showed the slide with the yellow triangles and the green squares, you may have noticed that, here, let me go and try to share that real quick. So right here, you can see that a lot of the yellow triangles have green squares in their vicinity. And I suspect what happened in a lot of these cases is the rookery just shifted over. It's not that it's gone forever. It's just that back in 1990 it was here, and back in the 80s maybe it was here. And it is normal for them to just shift and move over time. And like you said, the smaller they are, the more likely they are to kind of blink in and out of existence. The larger rookeries typically stay for long periods of time unless they're severely disturbed somehow. And then when that happens, a lot of times they'll break into smaller rookeries, and within several miles of the original one. And like you said, Christy, the number doesn't necessarily change. It's just that it moves around and shifts. So that was a really good point. And so obviously we have to be very careful before we draw any conclusions on population trends when we're looking at something while sitting in the office.
Yeah, and whoops.
Uh-oh. Sorry.
Sorry, my phone is. Yeah, one more comment I have to make too is it isn't always human disturbance that makes the rookeries move, but in all the years I was working and flying and kind of all over the state and flying over rookeries, sometimes you'd find a pair of red-tailed hawks that would show up nesting in the middle of a heron rookery. I've seen great horned owls in the middle of them. Well, then sometimes a bald eagle pair will show up in the middle of a heron rookery. Well, the herons don't tolerate that very well, and then they usually abandon that colony and move. So there's a number of reasons why they might move.
It looks like there are several questions on the chat. Do you have the chat open? Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, are
Carmen,
there,
you see?
so Bo, is this technology also good for osprey nests?
I'm assuming it would be. Those are generally really well monitored in the States. Maybe not. Maybe there is some work they can go into that. But since they are about the same size and shape, as far as I know, and I haven't looked at specific osprey nests using the aerial imagery, but since the size is similar, and I'm assuming that the color would be similar, like grayish white, then I don't see why not. I'm sure anything, as long as it's not too small, you'd be able to monitor this way, especially if you can narrow it down and know to look more around rivers. And I know some ospreys nest in fairly far away from a river, like a mile away. The nice thing about great blue herons is that they're almost always in cottonwood galleries. There's some places where you can find them in ponderosas and Lower Clark Fork, and there's places where you can actually find them nesting on the ground or shrubs, like Christy mentioned. But generally, they're really close to water. The problem with just searching randomly for osprey nests is that if the nest is on a pole by the highway a mile away from the river, and I'm sure all of you have seen these kind of nest locations, you end up with a really large area you'd have to carefully scroll through. And so that could be challenging, but I'm sure, with a little bit of thought and planning, it could probably be a viable way to survey for ospreys.
Do we know what the herons do during the winter season?
As far as I know, they congregate around, or they hang out around open water. I'm pretty sure they need that to some degree. I'm sure they're opportunists, so they can probably find food elsewhere, but they probably do need some open water, and that's why you see them a lot less in eastern Montana, where there's fewer large rivers or fast flowing rivers, I guess. I don't know enough about that, but I'm assuming wherever there's little fishies or invertebrates or anything like that, amphibians and stuff along rivers and ponds that they can actually access, and that's where they'll hang out.
Thank you. And so if anybody is interested in volunteering for this citizen science project, the survey actually takes place from May 1st through June 15th. There will most likely be a training sometime in late April, most likely over Zoom, just like this. And in the meantime, you can contact me. I put my email in the chat box on the right of the screen. It's carmen@mtaudubon.org. And if there's any further questions, even after this presentation, or if you want to express your interest right now, you can reach out to me and email me right now if you want to, and we can put you on the list.
Well, if there are not any other questions, Carmen and Bo, this is Kay, and I just want to say this has been wonderful. What fun. I really appreciate your coming and joining us.